I've always felt, and I think you can see it now, that the racism in Europe is probably more rampant than in the United States. So you can just watch with kind of wonder as Italy complains now about the flow of refugees from Libya. Now, Libya happens to be eastern Libya. The one part that's liberated happens to be the scene of the first major post-World War genocide carried out by the Libyan forces. And similarly, you have to wonder when France, which today is the main protector of the brutal dictatorships in its former colonies, manages to overlook its hideous atrocities in Africa, while Sarkozy warns grimly of what he calls the flood of immigrants, and Marine Le Pen objects that he's doing nothing to prevent it. I won't mention Belgium, which probably wins the prize for what Adam Smith called the savage injustice of the Europeans. You know all about that. The rise of ultra-right nationalist parties in much of Europe would be a frightening phenomenon, even if we were not to recall what happened in the continent not very long ago. So just imagine, say, if Jews were being expelled from France to misery and oppression, and after imagining that, witness what is happening, and rather what is not happening, when Roma, who are also victims of the Holocaust, are expelled from France to misery and oppression, Europe's most brutalized population. In Hungary, the actual neo-fascist party gained 17% of the vote in national elections, the largest party, which is perhaps not surprising when 3/4 of Hungarians think that they're worse off today than they were under communist rule. You might be relieved that in Austria, the far-right Jörg Haider party won only 10% of the vote in the last election. You'd be relieved about that until you notice that they were outflanked from the right by an even more rabid ultranationalist party, which got 27% of the vote. You might recall, it's kind of chilling to recall, that in 1928, the Nazis won less than 3% of the vote. Things changed fast. In England, the British National Party, English Defence League, on the ultra-racist right are major forces. In Germany, a book by Thilo Sarrazin lamenting that immigrants are destroying Germany was a runaway bestseller. The Chancellor, Angela Merkel, she condemned the book, but she added that multiculturalism had utterly failed. That is, the Turks who were brought in to do the dirty work in Germany are failing to become true Germans. As she put it, they're not adopting our Judeo-Christian heritage. The Judeo part was put in for obvious reasons. They're not adopting our Christian heritage. And therefore, multiculturalism has failed. Well, I've barely skimmed the surface of these critical issues, but I don't want to end before making one last comment about what's called an externality in economic theory, something you don't pay attention to when you're making transactions. In the financial system, there is an externality that's well known. It's called systemic risk. That if you make a transaction, you don't pay attention to the fact that it may crash the system. And when that happens, it's not a big problem because the taxpayer rescues you. There's another externality, which is a little more serious, and that's destruction of the environment. It's almost an imperative that in semi-market societies that the environment must be destroyed. That's close to an institutional imperative. Business leaders right now are conducting major propaganda exercises to try to convince the population that anthropogenic global warming, human participation in global warming is just a hoax. Now, those same business leaders understand very well that the danger is quite real, and it might destroy what they own and their grandchildren's lives. But they can't, that's an externality. They can't pay attention to it in their institutional role as business leaders. They have to maximize the profit and market share. If they don't, they're out, and somebody else is in which does it. It's an institution, it's a property of the institution, and therefore it happens no matter what the consequences. And that, again, creates a vicious cycle, but this one might be truly lethal. In fact, to see how grave the threat is, just take a look at the new Congress in the United States, mostly business-funded, propelled into power by business funding and also propaganda. Almost all of them are climate deniers. They've already begun to cut funding for measures that might mitigate potential economic disaster, including funding for the International Agency, for the Environmental Protection Agency, and so on. Worse still, some of them are true believers. For example, the head of one new committee on the environment, the new head, he explained that global warming can't be a problem because God promised Noah that there wouldn't be another flood. Okay, that takes care of that. But the current economic crisis is also traceable in no small measure to an equally fanatic faith, a fanatic faith in certain dogmas, like, say, the efficient market hypothesis, and more generally to what Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz back in the 90s called the religion that markets know best. They'll take care of everything, so don't pay attention to what's happening. That sufficed to prevent the Federal Reserve, the central bank, and almost the entire economics profession from paying attention to the fact that a housing bubble was developing, $8 trillion housing bubble, not based on any economic fundamentals, and completely off the there had been a record of 100 years of the housing prices more or less tracing economic growth. All of a sudden it shot up by $8 trillion and not based at all on economic fundamentals, but you didn't have to pay any attention to it because of the religion. Well, devastated the economy when it burst. And as I said, the financial crisis, somebody can come to the rescue, the taxpayer, but environmental crisis, there's nobody around to come to the rescue. Well, all of this and plenty more can proceed as long as the Muashar doctrine prevails. That is, as long as the general population is passive, obedient, apathetic, diverted, maybe to consumption, maybe to hatred of the vulnerable. And as long as that's the case, the powerful can do as they please, and those who manage to survive can contemplate the outcome.